Greetings and a warm welcome from me, astrologer Patrick Arundell. Today, in the latest of my deep dive videos, I'm going to explore the 151-day retrograde journey of Uranus through the sign of Taurus, which begins on August the 29th and lasts through till January the 27th. It's going to invert 4 degrees through that whole process, but it's also going to go through 2 decans of Taurus. The first is sub-ruled by the rather strict energies of Saturn, the second by Mercury. So I think that's particularly significant too. Now, if you're new to my channel, thank you so much for joining us. This is very much a community. If you have any thoughts, please share them. I do try to interact with each one. If you're yet to subscribe to my channel, I'd be honoured if you do so now. If you're a returning visitor or already a subscriber, thank you so much for joining me once more. Now, I'm briefly going to outline how I'm going to structure the video. I'm going to talk about some of the themes of Uranus in Taurus, give you the time frame of when Uranus moved into Taurus. It first went there for 5 months, for example, in 2018, but of course it went into that massive right angle that lasted 2 years within 3 degrees with Saturn, its co-ruler of Aquarius, which concluded in the autumn of 2022 in the north and the spring in the southern hemisphere. But that was very abrasive and very tricky. So what can we expect from this retrograde? What does the retrograde represent? It's very important if you're a fixed sign and you have planets in the sign of Taurus, Leo, Scorpio or Aquarius between 16 and 26 degrees. But also, if you're a Libran or a Sagittarian, this event could see a quincunx with some of your planets. So also, of course, you may not be one of those signs, but you may have planets that are going to be influenced directly by Uranus. So we need to understand which natal house the Uranus retrograde is impacting within your personal situation, and also the collective, which is in essentially house 2, very much about everyday money, self-worth, our personal values. And also the sign of Taurus is very much about farming, our clothes, and the things we enjoy in life, whether it's good food or good wine. Now, I'd just like to share with you a very exciting opportunity. Year 2023 is speeding by, and year 2024 is racing towards us. If you'd like to order your year 2024 personal forecast based on your unique birth data now, I will prepare for you the rest of year 2023 free of charge. But in my special package of 30% off, you can also get your character analysis report, your life roadmap, which will give you searing insights into the patterns that have played out in your life so far, but also give you a much more intimate understanding of how to deal with them. Please see the link below for more. And I'd just like to say, if you've yet to watch your year 2024 Zodiac forecast, you can see the link for this underneath this video, and this is completely free. So first up, I'd just like to share with you all the maths. So the 29th of August 2023 at 2:38 and 39 seconds AM Universal Central Time is when Uranus slams on the brakes. Now, Uranus can go into its retrograde, its annual retrograde, up to 155 days, but this year it is 151. When the process begins, it is at 23 degrees and 4 minutes. It will retreat, as I mentioned before, pretty well exactly 4 degrees through till 19 degrees and 5 minutes. So if you have any major influences in your natal chart between 16 and 20 degrees, be it across those fixed signs of Taurus, Leo, Scorpio or Aquarius, or Libra and Sagittarius in the quincunx of 150 degrees, you're likely to feel this in a more antagonistic way, but it doesn't mean to say that there won't be opportunities. Because when planets station a retrograde, what they tend to do is manifest a much greater extent of their power. So what we have initially is Uranus going between its sub-decan rulership of Saturn, which will go on through till the 11th of December, and then from then through to the 27th of January, it's influenced by Mercury through its rulership of Virgo. So if we think about it, Uranus going retrograde in the sign of Taurus, which is very much about our resources, but it is a fixed sign and it's earthy, and Uranus is an impatient influence. Its electric energy wants to make things happen quickly. And of course, the sign of Taurus is essentially very practical, patient, can be resistant to change, perhaps even a little stubborn, and therefore the more antagonistic energy of Uranus is an awakener anyway. So just to share with you, Uranus moved into Taurus in May 2018. It was immediately in a square with Uranus, which at that time was just parked up at 0 degrees in Aquarius. So that was quite a tricky influence. Went on for 5 months, back into Aries, but returned into the sign of Taurus on the 9th of March 2019 and has been there ever since. Now, of course, if you've got any fixed planets between 0 degrees and where we've got to now at 23, Uranus is likely to have had some kind of impact. In my own situation, I have the Sun at 0 degrees and 30 minutes in Aquarius, then the Sun Moon midpoint at 6 degrees Aquarius, and then a gathering of the Moon, Venus and Chiron all around 10 or 12 degrees in Aquarius. So over the last couple of years, a lot of consideration about where to live and how to live there, and it's been very restless, and it's still not a done deal. It's still not settled. So Uranus can be quite difficult to deal with in some ways, but what it's doing is provoking us to find our inner truth, because Uranus is the planet which rules the sky in mythology. So through its higher octave rulership of Aquarius, its rulership of Aquarius, is pushing us to find that higher truth and be quite uncompromising as well. So the lightning-like energy of Uranus can push us to make some changes. In my case, I lived in my previous home for many decades, and we've moved, and hopefully we're going to be moving again, but this time hopefully it's to where we will be long term. So a provocative influence to leave what was safe and stable and consistent, because Uranus really provokes us to pursue things that may not necessarily be easy, but it's liberating us from some kind of fixed and routine structure which isn't necessarily working in the sign of Taurus. Now, of course, Uranus can make things happen very, very quickly, unexpectedly, and rather uncomfortably. And as I mentioned, it's very much the planet of breakdown and breakthrough. And the breakthroughs can be actually very exciting, a scintillating energy. So it's almost like being on a roller coaster that maybe the brake isn't working, but actually it's an extremely exhilarating journey at times. And through this process, it can awaken us and push us to liberate ourselves, to find our deeper truth, to find our sense of independence and freedom. And, you know, it can in some ways be very much a wake-up call, so not necessarily easy at all. Now, of course, the sign of Aquarius, with its Uranus rulership, it's very much about being future-orientated, open to innovation, rather independent, and perhaps at times being much more prepared to be different to others. So we're being asked with this retrograde to be much more comfortable with the things that set us apart. It's not always the most trodden path that's the best for most of us. It's the most authentic path that's the best. And that's what Uranus can push us to do. Because if we're getting our ego identification in Taurus by trying to comply and fit in with that safe, regular and very fixed environment that Taurus appreciates, what it could do at some level is see us displace our need to be free and to be truly ourselves, displace it in some way which can end up with tension in our body, headaches, feeling irritable, or actually giving our power away a little bit. So sometimes we do need to dare to be different and not be so inclined to play the game. So that's very Aquarius energies in its more progressive vibe, which comes from Uranus. Of course, it's a duality through that sign because Saturn promotes an appreciation of continuity, history and tradition. But certainly Uranus on its own is pushing us to be that much more provocative. Now, this of course is the planet that rules technology, and along with Pluto making that brief appearance for 11 weeks in Aquarius, we have seen a huge amount of discussion around AI. And because Taurus is the sign of everyday money, how are we going to find our way of feeding and providing for ourselves if more and more robotics and automation and AI comes in? So that's one of the existential questions that we're all being faced with at the moment, and it is a bit nerve-wracking, let's be honest about it. But that innovation through the sign of Taurus could see technologies applied more and more to food growing and food distribution, because the sign of Taurus very much about food. And some of the things that are being developed might be good, like new sources of non-meat protein, but we're also seeing quite a lot of discussion about the non-meat products that have been sold over the last few years that have really come into vogue. And in fact, they're just incredibly highly processed foods and not tremendously good. So to get all the flavour into them, it's all those additives and preservatives and all the rest of it. So although it may seem like it's following a trend which is very much for the higher good of animal welfare, we're growing all sorts of crops to feed these new ways of eating which aren't necessarily sustainable or good for the planet. And of course the earth is governed by Taurus. We're also seeing with the electric energy of Uranus a lot of fires, a lot of earthquakes. Flooding has become more and more prevalent as our ecosystem is coming under a lot of strain, perhaps from our desire to consume. And I think the second house, Taurus energy, is a lot to do with consumption. And another thing that we've seen with the transition of Uranus through Taurus is a lot of volcanic and seismic energy, earthquakes. Look at what happened in Turkey, in Pakistan. Volcanoes that have lain dormant for a long time are bursting into the open. Another indication of the power and the intensity and the heat that Uranus can create for planet Earth. So I think the retrograde period is asking us to really amp up our thinking about how we can deal with these challenges and not just go with the flow, not just be reactive. We need to actually try to anticipate what's good for ourselves and really plan ahead. And that may mean, especially because the cost of raw resources has shot up at such an exorbitant rate in the last couple of years, that we're all in some ways being affected by a difference in the value that we can obtain with our money. So it's not necessarily just a case of being inventive. We have to squeeze more from our resources in order to deal with where we are. So we have seen a lot of disruption, particularly to the cost of borrowing, cost of rentals and mortgages, and obviously the cost of raw fuel. And there have been some other things that have really been affected in recent months. And I think it is a very Uranian energy. So Uranus is very much to do with that direction of travel that's very fresh and thinking outside the box, but also because the sign of Taurus is very much about slowing things down. This is obviously being aided by Jupiter, which is a very good asset for the sign of Taurus, I feel, because Taurus makes Jupiter less inclined to promise more than it can realistically deliver. So over the last few years, with the stimulus that was used to try to get things moving again after the 2008-9 crash, there was a lot of money being printed by central governments, quantitative easing. That may have been the more daring energies of Uranus influencing that. And of course, Uranus may have been a lot to do with the expansion of digital currencies, which in itself is a very exciting concept. Because if you think, if one particular currency is the anchor for the world, it gives that particular state a lot of power, which isn't necessarily always a bad thing in some ways, in terms of pushing it back against other currencies which may have governmental intent which is a bit more sinister. But the idea of digital currencies is very egalitarian, but they've really taken a big hit recently. Why is it that financial affairs have been so impacted? Well, I do feel it's the spring of 2022 and the autumn. We've seen the Scorpio Taurus eclipse series, and the first one was definitely impacted by the North Node in Taurus at that time. The second one by Uranus, again in a square with Saturn. So as last year came to a close, we had another big shake-up, and we are going to have on the 28th of October this year the final eclipse, lunar eclipse featuring Taurus and Scorpio, which is going to occur and provide the energy that takes us into the first few months of 2024. But remember what I was saying about food production and farming and how technology may play a greater part, that very Uranian energy. But we also have to be aware that some of this is altering the way that we have done things for a very, very long time. So this fast change isn't necessarily something that we can all computate very quickly. So I think we are going to experience in this particular retrograde some more disruption, maybe disruption more to the planet in terms of those combustible events that have been occurring a great deal, particularly when the Sun was squaring Uranus. That really seemed to coincide with a lot of the fires that were going on. But we do have an opportunity with the retrograde to think about all these issues: what we eat, how we make money, how we cook, how we value ourselves. Are we resisting change because we prefer to cling to the routines that feel safe? Do we need to accept that some of the things that are being proposed that are supposed to be very good for us and innovative, like electric vehicles, actually can have some huge downsides? For example, if there's not the charging points, the infrastructure, the vehicles take too long to charge. Is it actually true that in the bigger picture that we should immediately discard some of the older ways of doing things? Because maybe Uranus energy, although it's provocative and thought-provoking and about change, it also asks us to stand back and see the big picture and see things in the round. So I think whether it's in terms of our own personal attitudes to those resources, our values, where we feel that we gain stability in our lives, this is definitely a time not to be too fixed and resistant to change. And Uranus will push us to push out of our life anything which isn't really working. And of course, Uranus also, like space, independence, can be quite outspoken. Taurus energy is much more placid and much more to do with maintaining the status quo. So those are some themes that I feel that the Uranus retrograde is going to provoke. And it's a time for us to think inwardly about our relationship to our own authenticity, how we can value ourselves in a way that still works for us. We may have to make some pragmatic trades. We can't get everything on our own terms. Uranus pushes us to be quite reckless in order to be very outspoken, but sometimes some of the things that have sustained us for a very long time are there because they've worked. So I don't think it's a time to be too rash and too quick to get rid of any part of our existence that served a good purpose, but it's certainly a time to carry out an extremely extensive and major inner review. What I want to do now is just share on the screen the natal event chart. The interesting thing about this, based on Universal Central Time and Greenwich, it just puts Uranus in the 10th house, which is how we're all affected collectively. So this is the sunlight part of the chart, and very Capricornian in a way. It's what we can all relate to. So you can see that Uranus is forging a really positive link with Mercury. So that is asking us, despite Mercury's retrograde, to keep thinking outside the box. It's just that, although Uranus forges a lovely sextile to Neptune, Mercury and Neptune are in an opposition. So clarity around communication, especially if we are trying something different and fresh, Uranus, and it's to do with our work, can still be rather cloudy, somewhat murky. I'd just like to point out the midpoint between the Sun and the Moon is 21 degrees in Scorpio, so that puts Uranus on the 7th house or descendant of that point. So our relationships, I feel, can be changeable based on these outer world, these worldly events that seem to be changing and quite turbulent, which I think we can get with Uranus in the 10th house. Now I'm just sharing with you briefly now the event chart based on the solar wheel, and the ascendant essentially being at 0 degrees Aries on the vernal point. Of course, that puts Uranus in house 2, the midpoint in house 8, longer term and shared finances, and Mercury, the planet of discussion, planet of communication, in its home sign of Virgo, the 6th house, is pushing us to think of new ways in which we can perhaps lead our daily routines, especially with the retrograde ongoing. Now, please stay with me as I go through each of the 12 zodiac signs from Aries through to Pisces, and I'll give you a flavour of what you can expect over the next 5 months. So Aries, you have the reputation of being a bold decision maker. When you get the germ of an idea that really excites you, or you're drawn towards a new interest, or even potentially someone you fancy, you tend to make things happen, which really, for me, is a thrilling energy that you possess. It's just that Saturn and Neptune means that whatever you're trying to push towards at the present time may not be going quite at the speed that you would normally expect. And I feel that Uranus retrograde through to January is just saying to you that if you do come up with a new idea that is designed to improve your income or the foundations of your existence, or you want to rethink perhaps your own approach to situations in terms of how you feel about your self-worth and value, this is probably not the best of times to get frustrated if you can't make things happen at that normal breakneck speed, because I just don't think Saturn's going to allow you to do it anyway. And of course, as this event begins, Mercury is angling to Uranus in a retrograde, so care with details is going to be essential. But that doesn't mean to say that you can't make progress, because in a way what Uranus retrograde can do, and along with that Saturn position, also retrograde in your 12th house, is just encourage you to take your time going through the different processes and exploring Uranus, the truth of a situation, but also finding the Taurus energy, the vibe to sustain your research or checking out of a situation long enough to really get a full understanding of what the opportunities are, or potentially what the challenges may be. So what I'm saying to you essentially is, in the next 5 months, if there is an opportunity that comes up to seize the moment when it comes to perhaps spending some money on something that you've long wanted, or it is an investment opportunity, or maybe even a little bit of flutter, if you don't feel that you're in your natural mode of being very quick and decisive, don't beat yourself up about it. Actually, what Uranus is doing is acting as an asset to you in its retrograde by getting you to really think very thoroughly through all the different strands of information, and it means that you will be better informed to make the right kind of decisions. Now, this will be particularly so around your earnings and your work through to the 11th of December, whilst Uranus is rewinding through the subdecan ruled by Saturn. But then from the 11th of December through to the 27th of January, it could be you are going to, in some ways, be thinking about your job, or perhaps the amount of recognition you get, or the benefits outside of the actual money you earn. So a time not to get frustrated if things don't go quite at the normal speed, but there's still opportunities for sure. So Taurus, the chances are since 2019, the last 4 years, you really have experienced some quite dramatic energies impacting your situation. If you've been pushed to comply with something that's been essentially taken away your oxygen as an individual, this is where you may have expressed the greatest amount of rebellion. Perhaps you've been rebelling against yourself. Your own tendency to stick with what you know may be something that's really been pushed right to the edge, and then you found that if you have embraced some changes, particularly with Pluto's help as well in house 9, it's been really quite exhilarating. But of course, with change doesn't necessarily mean that as we go through a change we get to the outcome that we want straight away. Sometimes it can open up some issues, and once things start to change, it's very difficult to resist the whole process. So it doesn't necessarily follow that Uranus has been easy, but it's certainly been provocative, and it's certainly pushing you to try to get your identity, which is what the first house is about, your body, into a situation where you feel you're living your best life in the most exciting and invigorating way, which is what Uranus is really about. It's about feeling there is a sense of freshness, and that things aren't too stuck. And of course, because your sign doesn't like Uranus, it prefers to have the status quo, there may have been at times when things have changed around you. Other people may have decided to alter things which has had an impact on you, whether it's been to do with work or where you live, and that may have been deeply discombobulating. But essentially it's still more of an opportunity than a challenge. It's just down to accepting it into our lives and then just deciding, whoa, this is going to be fun, I'm going with it. And once we're in that mode, then things become much more stimulating. But if you are in a situation where you have made some changes and you're not quite sure how they've worked out for you, and you may feel that there's more change needed, and that seems quite daunting, I think the next few months, the next 5 months, is a time to carefully consider all your options. But there may be a sense that you don't have time on your side, which would be totally understanding. But again, it's your relationship to Uranus's energy which is the key. If you are accepting of it, it's going to be much more tolerable for you. If you're resisting it, it's going to increase the tension and make things that much more difficult. So Gemini, for you, you're not a fixed sign, and nor are you in a quincunx such as Libra and Sagittarius, but you do have Uranus in your 12th house, and that has not been easy. If you have been experiencing over the last 4.5 years, a much greater difficulty to sleep or turn off or to unwind, you feel over aroused in terms of your adrenal system. It doesn't matter how much exercise you're doing, there always seems to be a hyper alertness about you. I think it really is to do with Uranus. But the great thing about Uranus going retrograde in the 12th house, it really asks you, what can you gain in terms of higher knowledge about faith, about spirituality, about what really makes you tick at a deeper level. And if this is an area that you have been resisting somewhat, then Uranus retrograde gives you a wonderful opportunity to meditate on all of these things right through to the end of January in a way which I feel can bring greater integration into your life. So if you are someone who works very much through the prism of your intellect and your quick wits and your humour and your dazzling personality, that's just the average Gemini, of course, understood. But if you are pushing to one side some fears and anxieties or uncomfortable truths, Uranus, remember the planet of higher truths, is pushing you over this next 5-month period to really let it all in. Now, some may say, Cancer, that you're not the natural radical. I don't necessarily agree with that, because you're a feeling sign. If you feel something very strongly, that doesn't mean to say that you can't express an opinion or have a view or a direction in life which is different to what's expected in terms of the archetype that you're welded to the home, to the family, which may be very important issues to you, but there's a lot more to you. And over the last 4.5 years, Uranus has been pushing you to set a much more radical future for yourself, which really does meet your highest expectations. You may still be looking for all the usual strands that are important for a Cancerian person to feel secure and safe and protected, but I think there has been a much more daring strand that's been developing within the overall mix. But what often happens, I feel, in life is that we can achieve a particular aspiration, but once we get there, we realise that actually we've changed and we need to reset our focus in a sharper, more precise way to a new target. Now, that can be in the material world, but the 11th house, where Uranus is for you, is very much about your higher mission. It's to do with your friendships, and it's to do with your higher belief system. So I think the retrograde over the next 5 months gives you an awful lot of food for thought to contemplate whether what you've been moving towards is still what really motivates you, or do you need to refresh that? Because Uranus is about refreshment in a way. It is about being serenely honest with ourselves to refocus and go again. So only you can answer that question, but Uranus is certainly giving you the encouragement to make sure that you're on the long-term path. The 11th house, very much about our future plans. You're linking with the people who are really gratifying and good for you. If you have friendships that are stale and aren't working, then perhaps Uranus retrograde is asking you to break free and liberate yourself, and not just stay with situations because it does in some way feed another part of your nature which really values security and stability. So Leo, in some ways I feel that perhaps Uranus has been as challenging for you as it has been for Taurus in the last few years, because your sign also really appreciates a degree of continuity. And as I've said to you before, my experience of Leos, and I have some very good friends who are Leos, like to work collaboratively with someone else, even though you often like to have the role as the leader within that collaboration. But it could be that through your work particularly, which is what Taurus, the 10th house, represents, there maybe things have changed when you weren't really wanting them to. The continuity may have been fine for you as it was, or maybe you have been the one that's actually enjoyed breaking free of something that you used to do, because you have actually found it very liberating, but it may have left you without some of those structures that you used to have that in their own way were very comforting, and you may still be trying to make sense of it. Then again, you may have pushed yourself into the limelight over the last 4.5 years and done something that, which for you in the past may have been a bit more radical or challenging. You may have done something that's put you in the public eye in a way which is exciting, but also potentially unsettling. The 10th house can also be the sector of our parents. Have your parents been unpredictable, or have there been a lot of demands around that part of your situation? Not through anyone's fault, just because circumstances change. Or if you are a parent, have your children's needs been quite changeable over the last 4.5 years? So these are some of the scenarios that I feel have played out for you. Pluto, of course, for the main part, apart from those 11 weeks, has been in house 6, which is very much about being of service to others, making sure all the sort of nuts and bolts parts of life are pretty sustained, and that may have been an area that you've actually, taken on quite a lot of obligations to support others, but at other times the Uranian energy may have come in and seen you quite frustrated if you've been pinned in, or you've had a lot of demands and neediness pushed in your direction. So I feel from now through till January, if you're not feeling fulfilled in your worldly role, this is a time to really make some serious plans to try to change things, knowing that there is that part of your nature that can be resistant to that change, and it might not be a completely comfortable process, but it may be one that you need to go through in order to get you to that authentic point where you achieve the recognition for what makes you sparklingly charismatic. It's important to many Leos to be recognized, but you may have to take a little bit of a walk on the wild side to really get all the rewards you crave. So the really interesting thing about this event, Virgo, for you is that your ruler Mercury is leaning into the position of Uranus, but is in a retrograde. So you've been given a push to reinvent some part of your everyday approach, which is the first house. Obviously Neptune's opposite Mercury, so some of the signals that you're getting from others seem shifting, not necessarily clear. That could be creating a bit of uncertainty. But the potential to rethink, obviously Mercury is about thinking, your individual input and approach is definitely emphasized at the moment. So Uranus, therefore, in its retrograde, presents a huge opportunity to not just play one particular role in your life, which is often to support others in some way or another. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a very noble thing that many Virgo people do. You're often the glue, along with Taurus folks in a way, that keeps everything together, because you're so grounded and practical and make things work. So people can come up with dramatic ideas, but you know that needs application, attention to detail and persistence to really make it stick. So that's your gift. So what Uranus is saying to you is that may be your gift, but are you feeling really bored? Because if you are feeling bored, your pragmatism, as I've mentioned recently to you, is pulverizing your passion. That's what you need to really rethink. So from now right through to the end of January, if you think about doing a course of study, traveling somewhere that's completely different to anywhere you've been before, being a little bit more radical in your approach to the situation, thinking outside the box, not necessarily automatically accepting the way things are. This is a time to really challenge the status quo. And the 9th house is about freedom, independence and liberation. So if you're not feeling fulfilled in whatever support role that you may be providing, whether you operate a business that supports others or you do it in your personal life, what Uranus is saying is be much more open to changing things, even if it does mean leaving something that you know intimately. And of course, the whole process, as I mentioned before, may not be particularly comfortable, but because the 9th house is really about getting in touch with where we can just freely ventilate our whole being and really find that life is stimulating, has variety, spontaneity. If you're lacking those things at the moment, that's what Uranus is pushing you in its retrograde to become much more mindful of pursuing. So Libra, for you, in a way, there's a paradox, because house 8, where Uranus is solar and ascendant wise, is very much about where we're most invested. but we don't tend to get invested where we feel that we might lose our right to our freedom, our personal space. So it's a very intimate place. But then perhaps you've gone through that process, you have invested, whether it's in a business, whether it is in a partnership, whether it is in a romance, but then it's not feeling quite as you would like. And that could be the point that you really need to grapple with from now through to the end of January, because of course Mercury, the planet of communication that's angling to Uranus, is in house 12 for you, very much about deep diving into some potentially sensitive and vulnerable strands that you might not want to look at. So if you are in a situation where you feel it isn't really working, Uranus is pushing you to accept the truth of that situation, even if it means pushing against the other part of your nature that would prefer to maintain the status quo, keep things pleasant and light and keep that equilibrium in place. I totally get it because of my Libra ascendant, but sometimes we have to really take our courage in our hands and go for what's really right for us. Now, the other thing that could happen is completely the polar opposite. You may find yourself suddenly pitching in a situation which does require a lot more commitment, but doing it in quite a quick and exciting way that may actually be a real surprise to you too. Now also the 8th house, in a much more practical sense, is around things like pensions and savings, investments, property matters, and we know, all of us collectively, that all of these areas have been under a lot of pressure. But of course Uranus can be about thinking outside the box. It can be about ingenuity. So if you can find a way to manage your resources in a more skillful manner, perhaps by new ideas, new approaches, perhaps even by using technology. For example, accountancy. If your accountancy costs can be decreased because you're working with someone who maybe does use much more modern techniques, it may actually be a lot less expensive than using, the same old-fashioned processes that, were very comforting but may not necessarily be so appropriate for the age that we're now in. So that's just a little bit of a flavour for you. So Scorpio, what have your relationships been like ever since that 5 months of 18 and ever since March 2019? Have you had some dramatic people coming into your world, perhaps not necessarily sticking around, but it may have created quite the whirl and quite a lot of heightened, passionate interactions? But of course Uranus can also be about space. The 7th house can be about setting our boundaries. Can also be where we suddenly encounter people that may not actually have our best interests at heart and don't mind telling us that they're not particularly in favour of us. So Uranus could have entered and manifested itself in your life in lots of different ways. Perhaps you've been someone who's been in a very long-standing situation and decided that it needed to change in some ways, and perhaps between the two of you, you've actually done that. You have grown and evolved in a way which is really pleasing through sharing truthful exchanges about what each of you need and adapting each of your approaches to help the growth of that situation. So it just depends. The next 5 months, if you're single, could see someone very exciting enter your orbit. Whether they stick around or not is a moot point. But if you're looking for excitement in terms of relationships, Uranus could provide it. Or it could see you wanting to separate yourself from something that isn't working. There's lots of different permutations for you with Taurus, the Uranus in Taurus retrograde. Now, Sagittarius, for you, what Uranus has been asking and provoking you to do is revolutionize your everyday existence, whether it's at work, your dietary approach, your routines, the way you approach the space. That's always important to Sagittarius people. You're being asked to be much more open to novel approaches and doing things that are a little bit more left field, most of which is not really a problem to you. The bigger problem, I feel, is that the 6th house can be very dull. It is about those micro details that are hardly the sort of world and broadly philosophical strands that a lot of Sagittarians find very uplifting, such as travel, such as expanding and doing things off the cuff and being, very spontaneous. The sixth house is about, being very metronomic in our approach to the minutiae of life, which can, as I say, be very dull and boring for a sign like yours. So what Uranus has been doing is perhaps opening you up more to how you can use technology, fresh approaches, trying different jobs, and perhaps also accepting that you may in some ways need to be a little bit more sacrificing. You can't necessarily get your need for space and freedom, which is Uranus really understands, in every facet of your life. There has to be some give and take. So these are the things that you're going to be grappling with in a big way over the next 5 months. So Capricorn, because Uranus is angling to Mercury, which is in your 9th house, which is knowledge, travel, expansion, adventure, but it is retrograde, of course, and Uranus retrograde in your 5th house, which is about pleasure, showcasing your talents, your joys, being much more free-spirited, really. So how have you been doing in terms of the free-spirited that Uranus has been encouraging you to embrace ever since 2019? If you found that you've shook up your life, particularly your romantic and social interactions, quite a big way, you may have found it quite the journey, really quite the buzz, particularly if you're someone who in past times has tended to be much more in keeping with the archetype of your sign, really being much more safety first, whereas Uranus is potentially quite a reckless influence in the 5th house. Could have seen you really pushing outside your comfort zone. It just depends on your natal chart and how you approach things in an overall way, not just your sun sign or ascendant. So I would say the next 5 months suggest that if you've yet to really feel supercharged by the excitement and electricity of Uranus, this is priming you up to really go for it. If you have done some stuff and it hasn't necessarily always worked out exactly as you hoped, I think the one thing you would agree is it has blessed you with a lot of rich experiences, even if they've not necessarily been all sweet experiences, but it certainly won't have been a dull moment. But you are being pushed at the moment to really be a bit more provocative towards yourself, really. If you're someone who really does love going about your life in quite the structured, very Capricornian way, with applying yourself in a very patient and step-by-step manner, it's all very virtuous. But is it in some ways denying you the thrill of living life a little bit on the edge, which is when we really can feel that the experience of life is most vivid, and that's really what you're being asked to consider and reflect over the next 5 months. So Aquarius, the last few years has been quite the challenge with your 2 rulers, Uranus and Saturn, in such a tense right angle, which really reached that peak in late September last year, but we're still threading into the lunar eclipse of the 8th of November. And it depends exactly where you have planet or the sun in Aquarius, just how much you've been impacted. But if you have got stuff right in the middle, from about 16 to 26 degrees, getting towards the end, you're going to experience this in a more vivid way. But you will have experienced Uranus already over the last few years if you're born earlier in Aquarius. And maybe there has been a need to separate yourself from certain situations, physical situations, like an area or an environment, a property, emotional chains which have held you back. Maybe to do, unfortunately, with family matters that haven't been working. So the potential for change around all those areas has been very strong, but also the potential for resistance. The more we resist, the more we increase the tension, because the fixed energy of Aquarius and of Taurus just amplifies the difficulty. So if there is something that isn't working in your emotional life, your relationship with yourself, if you're feeling very restless, finding it hard to sleep, switch off, You feel your immediate environment is too cramped, too spacious, too noisy, too quiet, whatever it is. What Uranus retrograde is asking you to do is to really think very honestly, to have some very honest conversations with yourself about what you do need to adapt and change to in order to get things to where you will feel safer, more at ease and more at peace, which is all very fourth house energy, which is where Uranus is in this solar perspective. So Pisces, for you, I feel there are different types of Pisces. Of course there are. Every single individual Pisces. Very, very different. But there are some commonalities. And if your chart has more of a Neptunian feel, escapism is one. You know, it's becoming almost non-present. And that could be around even your ideas or even your connection to people immediately around you. Uranus over the last few years may have given you a greater need for space. Alternately, if you've got a very Jupiterian chart, it may have given you a greater need for connection. It just depends on who you are. But I think this retrograde is asking you to challenge some of your ideas, because belief systems is governed by the third house. But also, of course, the third house can be about short journeys, can be about siblings, can also be about the community and our interaction with it. Uranus could see you, for example, in its retrograde, coming up with some brilliant ideas, perhaps to do with technology, software, blogging, where you can be absolutely inspired. If that's not your cup of tea at all, it could be that you do want to have a bit more space from all of those areas, because that part of you that in some ways, which reminds me of that Curtis Mayfield song, To Be Invisible. So that Neptunian, that shimmering need to be almost transparently, you know, just vaporize into your own space, because that privacy is important to you. Or it could be that the Uranus retrograde pushes you to share your ideas, particularly if you can train or teach people, or you can learn new skills from software, or you can learn yourself a course, perhaps in the comfort of your home using modern technology. So there's lots of ways that Uranus retrograde can play out for you, but it does depend on that type of Piscean you are within the overall spectrum of all Pisceans, who are all different anyway. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure being with you. Don't forget to check out your year 2024 yearly forecast, which are free to watch beneath this video. But for now, take care, stay safe, and all the best. Please like, comment, share, or subscribe.